Murdered, a podcast. I'm your host, AB.
And this week on Mama Murdered, a podcast, we're covering the second part of the Mandy Stavik case. Last week, we left off where Mandy's case, for all intents and purposes, had gone completely cold. And it was cold all the way up until 2009 when Detective Kevin decided that DNA had advanced enough to try to test the DNA that was collected in Mandy's case against DNA profiles that were now in a national database. And I know what you're thinking. You're guessing that Detective Kevin ran the DNA and found a match, and that's how this whole case was solved. But if you think that's how this case was solved, then buckle up because that's not even close. So with all that being said, and without further ado, let's get it. Now, during the decades that Mandy's case had been cold for, detectives who had originally been the ones working on Mandy's case would often run through like a list of theories as to what may have happened on the day that Mandy was murdered. These theories ranged from the murderer being someone that maybe Mandy knew, who maybe pulled up next to her while she was running, pulled a gun to force Mandy in the car to do, whatever they said. All the way to the theory that this could have been a complete stranger who just so happened to be in the same place as Mandy at the same time. Maybe this was a crime of opportunity. But nothing was concrete, and these theories were only going to take them so far, so Detective Kevin decided that he would gather as many new DNA samples as he could from people who were living in the area at the time that Mandy was murdered. These DNA samples would come from people who were willing to volunteer to give their DNA to detectives so that they could be processed and ruled out. But that's really all they could do with the DNA samples, was to use them to rule people out. Detective Kevin also went through and re-interviewed anybody who had been in the area at the time that Mandy was murdered. There were now more than 80 new samples of DNA that were collected after this case was cold and reopened. And yet, even with the case being reopened by the cold case unit, it would still take years for Detective Kevin and his team to follow up on leads before any closure was ever discovered. But it was during the follow-up of leads and tips and re-interviewing that Detective Kevin was finally introduced to a potential suspect named Timothy Bass. Tim Bass also just so happened to be a resident of Acme, and also someone that was familiar with Mandy and her family, because Tim's brother Tom Bass was one of the boys that Mandy had plans to go to the movies with on the day that she was reported missing and murdered. So this actually is somebody that Mandy would have known, and this was someone who was also familiar with Acme. But when Detective Kevin and his team went to question Tim Bass, he sort of acted like he didn't even really know who Mandy was. He was like, "Mandy who?" Now, come on, Tim. This was a big case. Mandy's name was known to everybody in the area, and it had been for decades. Let's not play stupid. So once Detective Kevin started to try to help Tim, regain his memory, Tim looked at the detective and was like, "Oh, Mandy, the girl that was found dead in the river, right?" Tim also told Detective Kevin that he didn't even really know Mandy like that, and that he didn't know where Mandy lived. And then when Detective Kevin asked him if he would be willing to give a sample of his DNA so that they could rule him out as a suspect, Tim told the detective that he would absolutely not be given a sample of his DNA without a warrant that was signed by a judge. And why else would you not want to give a sample of your DNA if you knew you were innocent? I'll never understand that, but some people just absolutely refuse to give their DNA whether they're guilty or not. And without any evidence linking Tim Bass to the murder of Mandy, no judge was going to sign off on a warrant to allow detectives to collect DNA samples from Tim Bass. They needed something, anything to link Tim Bass to Mandy so that they could get a warrant for his DNA. But again, this case would come to a standstill until the summer of 2013. And just to kind of put that into perspective, Mandy was murdered in 1989. We are now in 2013. That is entirely too long to not know what happened to your daughter. But in June of 2013, two moms, Heather Backstrom and Marley Anderson, met up with a few other moms at their local water park just to let the kids blow off some steam. And while the group of mothers sat around talking and chatting amongst themselves, Heather and Mary Lee, and I'm pretty sure I said that wrong a minute ago, but that's my correction. Heather and Mary Lee somehow got on the subject of Mandy's murder, and they were both baffled that her case still was unsolved. And as the conversation veered off onto the subject of Mandy's death, Heather says that she just turned to Mary Lee and said, "Well, I'm sure I know who killed her." And Heather was shocked when Marilee agreed with her and just said, like, yeah, me too. So these two regular-ass moms are at a water park just shooting the shit when they get on the topic of Mandy's murder, and they both just so happen to think that they know exactly who Mandy's murderer was. And while they obviously couldn't say for 100% certainty that they knew who killed Mandy, they did both have one man in mind that fit the bill. And they both even had like super scary encounters of their own with this same man back when they were younger. And this was a local Acme resident by the name of none other than Tim Bass. Yup, the same Tim Bass that had refused to give detectives a DNA sample just a few years earlier. Heather and Marilee had both suspected Tim Bass of being Mandy's murderer from the very beginning, and even decades later, both Heather and Marilee were skeeved out with their encounters that they'd had with Tim Bass. Marilee recalled that her husband and Tim Bass had been friends all throughout high school, and then years after high school, Tim just popped by Marilee and her husband's house one day, but when Tim stopped by, Marilee's husband wasn't home. She had never really cared for Tim, but he was a friend of her husband's, so she did let him come inside, where she was with her infant son. Tim told Marilee that he had just been out hunting and that he needed to borrow a phone. But while Tim was holding the phone to his ear, Marilee could hear the dial tone beeping through the phone, so Tim hadn't actually even made a call. But he hung the phone up like he had made a call, and he walked back through the house before he stopped Marilee to proclaim his undying love for her. Tim told Marilee that he loved her and that he'd always been in love with her, and he told her that he used to just drive past their house before he told her that he wanted to make love to her. So that escalated quickly and out of nowhere. Which this would make sense as to why he came over just to ask to use the phone and then didn't actually make a call. Marilee told Tim that he was insane and that they would never be together and that they would absolutely not be making love ever. But Tim doesn't do well with the word no, so he kept trying to move Marilee into her own bedroom with him before she finally yelled at him to get out of her house before she called the police. And luckily, after she threatened to call the police, Tim did leave without any further incident, which obviously he had to leave before she called the police. He had quite literally murdered a girl already and had gotten away with it thus far. I'm sure he wasn't going to risk having Marilee call the police on him. And while Marilee was telling Heather about this encounter she'd had with Tim, Heather had an encounter with Tim that was eerily similar to Marilee's encounter with him, except Heather's encounter with Tim happened when Heather was 15 years old, and it only happened just months before Mandy's murder. Heather had gone to a softball game and had gotten a ride home with her friend Dan, and Dan wasn't the only one in the car with Heather, though, because Dan had also been giving his good buddy Tim Bass a ride, too. And at this time, like I mentioned, Heather was 15 years old, so that would have made Tim 21 years old. Heather says that Tim had been extremely flirty with her for the entirety of this car ride, and that he'd even gotten a pen or a pencil and was tracing it up and down her legs and knees. But thank God that Dan was in the car with Heather and Tim also, and Dan was able to kind of keep Tim from trying anything further. But Heather says that after this car ride with Tim Bass that she would go out of her way to avoid being anywhere near him. And this just makes me wonder, how many other women has Tim tried this with? But at the time of these things happening, neither Heather nor Marilee, either one reported to police how creepy and how predatory Tim was. But it was after Mandy's death that both women had secretly feared that Tim Bass had struck again. This time with no buffer to save Mandy. And even after Mandy's death, Marilee and Heather both didn't feel like the things that Tim had done to them were enough to make investigators look into Tim. So again, they just never said anything about Tim to anyone. That was until they were at the water park retelling their experiences to one another, and they finally felt enough validation to actually report these experiences to the police. So that's exactly what they did. They went to the police together to report Tim Bass, and when they did, this only validated to detectives that they were on the right path to finding justice for Mandy, because the detectives had already been looking into Tim Bass, but they didn't have enough evidence to take the investigation any further. And by the time that police had these statements from Heather and Marilee, Tim had stopped cooperating with police altogether. And this case would again be stuck at a standstill until 2015. And in 2015, Detective Kevin tried one more time to talk to Tim to try to get a DNA sample. But again, Tim refused to give a DNA sample, but this time it seems like maybe Detective Kevin had gotten into Tim's head a little bit. Because Tim ended up eventually telling his brother Tom that he was worried that he was going to be a suspect in Mandy's case. Why would you be worried about that if you didn't do it? Tim also told Tom that he couldn't give the detectives a sample of his DNA. Are you ready for this? Because he and Mandy had actually had consensual sex while Mandy was home from college on her Thanksgiving break. Which is absolutely not true, not even a little bit true. And even Tim's brother Tom was not buying this story. Mandy had only been home from Thanksgiving break for 2 days, and the first day was the actual Thanksgiving holiday. And to hear Tim tell it, he saw Mandy and told her that she was, quote, keeping fit, and that was it. It was over from there. Mandy just could not resist a good compliment from a dirtbag that was way older than herself and had not at all accomplished anything out of life. No, she didn't. They didn't, and none of that is true. And if you think that this is Tim running Mandy's name through the mud now, don't worry, because it just keeps getting worse. Because Tim actually asked his brother Tom if the police came asking questions about Mandy, that Tom should tell police that he had also slept with Mandy too while she was home from Thanksgiving break. And you might be wondering, like, why would he need his brother to lie and say that he slept with Mandy too? And it's because Tim wanted to make it look like Mandy was just sleeping around with anybody and everybody, which she wasn't. So not only did Tim chase, rape, and murder Mandy, but he's also dragging her name through the mud and just making shit up. Mandy didn't sleep with Tim or Tom voluntarily, and she wasn't just sleeping around casually. If she had been, that's fine, like, get it, girl, but she wasn't. That's the thing, she wasn't. And if you thought that Tim was done, you'd be wrong, because Tim then went to his mom and asked his mom if they could just tell the police that his dead dad was the one that killed Mandy. Okay, so now he's trying to talk his mom into lying to the police and trying to pin this murder on his dead dad. This guy is quite literally a waste of oxygen, and I don't know if maybe Tim thought that his DNA and his dad's DNA would look the same if they were tested, but newsflash, buddy, that's not how that works. Like, sure, they would have familial DNA, but it wouldn't be an exact match, so that still wouldn't work. So this whole let's pin this murder on my dead dad thing was later retold by Tim's estranged wife. She apparently was there when he was asking his mom about pinning the murder on his dead dad. And according to Tim's ex-wife, Tim's mom just shook her head and put her hands in her head and told Tim, no, we're not doing that. Which, that makes me think that this isn't the first time that Tim had asked some off-the-wall shit of his mom, because even his own mom wasn't shocked or appalled by Tim asking her to lie to the police and pin a murder on his dead dad. So that leads me to believe that maybe his family has been helping him hide and get away with a whole lot of shit for his whole life. Now, Detective Kevin wasn't ready to give up on trying to either prove or rule out Tim Bass. So Detective Kevin had an idea. He went to the bakery that Tim Bass drove delivery trucks for, and he spoke with the manager, Kim Wagner. Detective Kevin asked Kim if there was any way that he would be able to swab the delivery truck that, Tim drove, and he wanted to swab the truck for touch DNA. But unfortunately, Kim was just a manager, and she didn't have the authority to tell the detective yes or no. So she did tell him that this was something that he would have to talk to the corporate office about and, get permission from them. But when Detective Kevin got in touch with the bakery's corporate office, they, for whatever reason, refused to allow Detective Kevin access to the bakery truck to be swabbed for touch DNA. And this would bring this case to yet another standstill for another 2 years. So jumping forward to the spring of 2017, since Detective Kevin hadn't been given permission to swab the truck for touch DNA, he had another idea. This time he went into the bakery and he asked the manager, Kim Wagner, if she would at least be able to tell him the route that Tim drove every day to make his deliveries. Now, up until this point, Detective Kevin hadn't mentioned to Kim that this was in relation to Tim Bass. But once Detective Kevin had asked for Tim's daily route, Kim asked if all of this had something to do with the Mandy Stavik murder, and Detective Kevin confirmed that it did. Once Detective Kevin told Kim that this was in relation to Mandy's case, Kim then asked if Tim Bass was a suspect in the murder case, and again, Detective Kevin said that he was. So I find it a little bit weird that Kim jumped straight to thinking that this had to be something to do with Mandy's case, especially since Detective Kevin hadn't mentioned Mandy's name to Kim. So maybe Tim Bass was just, creepy towards everybody? Maybe he just creeped everybody out? So now that Kim knows what the detective is poking around for, now Detective Kevin was able to explain to Kim that they would need Tim's delivery route. That way, if he threw away anything like trash or a soda can or a plastic spoon, the detectives would then be able to collect that discarded trash and use it to pull his DNA off of, which this was a genius move. Because once you toss something into the trash can or out of your car window, don't do that, that's littering, but it then becomes public property and it's up for grabs for anybody to collect, including the police to try to pull DNA off of. And Detective Kevin followed Tim for months on this delivery route, trying to catch Tim throwing anything away that could have his DNA on it. But Tim never threw anything away that contained his DNA, almost like he was paranoid about somebody collecting it and being able to trace something back to him. I don't know. But jumping ahead a few months to August of 2017, Kim and Tim were in the break room together when they bumped into each other. And when Kim realized that Tim was in the break room of the bakery drinking water out of a plastic cup, this got her wheels turning a little bit. And when Tim finished up with his cup of water, he tossed the plastic cup into the trash can of the break room. And Kim just took this opportunity to just do a little peeky peek, a little grabby grab. She grabbed the plastic cup out of the trash can and sealed it up in a Ziploc bag. The literal definition of she secured the bag. Now, once the bag was secure, Kim got in touch with Detective Kevin to let him know that she got it. She had the DNA that police had been trying to collect for decades. She had it, and it was freely handed over to detectives. And just as if that weren't enough, a few days after she had given Detective Kevin the plastic cup, she also saw Tim throw away a soda can, and she figured, what the hell, it can't hurt. So she also collected that soda can, bagged it up, and took it to Detective Kevin too. Just to be on the safe side. And can we just give it up for Kim Wagner? She is the real MVP, because I think I would be scared that he was going to see me or catch me trying to collect his discarded trash. Now, once Detective Kevin had these 2 samples of DNA, he put a rush order on those DNA samples, and when the results came back, the DNA from that plastic cup and that soda can were both a perfect match to the semen sample that was collected from Mandy's body. It was official. Tim Bass had raped and then killed Mandy Stavik in 1989, and he was finally going to be held accountable in 2017. Kim was later asked why she felt the need to collect the DNA from a coworker in relation to a murder of a girl that she didn't know. Kim said that if Tim had been the one to kill Mandy, that she at least wanted to do the right thing by Mandy. And that makes my heart so happy. So finally, on December 12th of 2017, Detective Kevin, along with Whatcom County Sheriff's deputies, they pulled up to the house of Tim Bass and they read him his rights and then placed him under arrest for the first-degree murder of Mandy Stavik. And it was during a press conference that Whatcom County Sheriff told reporters that this was one of the best moments throughout his entire career, was being able to tell Mandy's family that they were finally making an arrest. He also told reporters that the only reason that they were even able to make this arrest was because of the DNA sample that was taken from the discarded plastic cup and the soda can that Kim had collected. But for obvious reasons, the sheriff didn't actually say during the press conference that Kim, a civilian, had been the one to collect the DNA that was used to finally link Tim Bass to the murder. So not only were they only able to make this arrest thanks to Kim, but also, it's not like the detectives asked Kim to do that. She did that because it was the right thing to do and because she wanted to see justice in this case, just as bad as everybody else did. Now, the prosecutors were trying to collect any and everything in relation to this case so that they could prepare for the trial. Tim Bass was busy trying to literally beg his family members to provide him with an alibi. Tim asked his mom if they could maybe tell the police that the 2 of them had been out grocery shopping at the time that Mandy was murdered. And again, he is way too comfortable asking his mom to do this type of shit. And obviously, he isn't the brightest crayon in the pack because even with an alibi, that still doesn't explain your semen being found inside of Mandy's body. So even if his mom had agreed to lie and say that they had been out Christmas shopping that day, that still wouldn't justify why his semen was at the crime scene and on the murder victim. And Tim was also still on this shit about having his brother Tom lie and spread rumors that Mandy was sleeping around with multiple people. Tim said, quote, "Tom, do what you can. Maybe you can say other friends knew her back then too." Such a dirtbag. Tim Bass is so nasty. And none of that would help, though. I don't get it, because none of that would help. On December 14th, Tim Bass was brought before a judge where he was formally charged with first-degree felony murder. And the prosecution did explain to the public during a press conference that they weren't able to charge Tim with rape and kidnapping charges like they'd hoped because of the statute of limitations being up on those charges. So it had been too long for him to be able to be charged with the kidnapping and rape. Although they did eventually find a loophole for that, thank God. And Tim's defense attorney was trying their damnedest to get Tim off. The defense tried to have the DNA evidence excluded from the trial after filing motion after motion after motion. Tim's defense attorney actually tried to argue that Kim Wagner had been acting as an agent of the state when she collected the plastic cup and the soda can for DNA testing, which was an argument that they would make as to why they wanted the DNA to be excluded from the evidence list. But that's not true. Kim had never been asked to collect things with Tim's DNA on them. And that would again be because no one asked her to do this. And that's exactly what the prosecutor said too. The prosecution explained that Kim had not been asked or instructed to collect evidence, and Kim explained it herself that she had a daughter and that she would hope someone would do the same thing if it were her daughter. So obviously, the judge denied the request to remove the DNA evidence from the trial, and the trial was set to continue. It had been 30 years since Mandy Stavik had gone out for a run and never returned home. 30 years, and her killer was finally being held accountable. The trial started on May 10th, 2019, and the prosecution explained that the evidence told a story of what had happened on that day. They believed that Mandy had gone out for her run and that somewhere along the way, Mandy and Tim had an encounter, and that when Tim came in contact with Mandy, that he forced her at gunpoint to get into his car. From there, it's believed that Tim Bass took Mandy to a remote area where he raped her. They believe that Mandy did try to escape and that Tim was able to chase Mandy down and catch up with her, where he afterwards hit her in the head with something and it knocked her unconscious. From here, they believe that he threw her unconscious body into the river, which is where and how Mandy drowned. And then it also didn't look good that Tim had asked any and everybody to lie for him to try to make up an alibi. It also didn't look good that Tim had tried talking his brother into saying that Mandy was promiscuous and that she was sleeping around with multiple people. Now, as you might have guessed, Tim's defense team didn't have much to say except for to say that Mandy had slept with Tim prior to her death, which is why his semen was found in her body, and even though they had slept together, that Tim didn't know what happened to Mandy or who had done it. So the defense team is essentially saying, well, they slept together, but it's still unknown as to who the killer is and why. The defense team also claimed that there was no evidence of rape, and that there weren't any eyewitnesses that saw the abduction. So he's using the logic of a 1-year-old, the old if I can't see you, you can't see me thing, or like, oop, nobody saw that, so it didn't happen. And that was really his only defense. And then after a week of testimony, the jury took a little over 1 day to come back with the verdict of guilty on charges of first-degree murder. And like I said, the prosecution was somehow able to find a loophole so that they could still charge him with the rape and kidnapping charges on a special verdict. And the jury also found Tim Bass guilty of first-degree rape, first-degree attempted rape, first-degree kidnapping, and attempted first-degree kidnapping. So they hit him with all the charges, as they should. And of course the jury agreed that he was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. With the guilty verdict read aloud, the entire courtroom erupted in tears and relief, because after 30 years, they were finally getting some kind of justice for Mandy Stavik. And Tim Bass, he shouldn't be a problem to anyone else because he was sentenced to 26 years in prison. Now, after the sentencing, Tim's defense team did file an appeal in 2001, arguing that since the statute of limitations had been up for some of the charges, that the prosecution shouldn't have been able to charge Tim with those crimes. And in that appeal, it was also stated that the DNA sample that was collected to be tested shouldn't have been able to be used because of the way that it had been collected. And then, don't forget that this appeal argued that Kim had violated Tim's constitutional rights by collecting his DNA off of a soda can and a plastic cup that he tossed in the trash. And I don't know who's going to be the one to tell him, but after you rape and murder somebody, you don't have constitutional rights, buddy. That's just not how that works. Now, to the argument of Kim being the one to finally get Tim's DNA sample, the justice decided that it would be pretty hard to prove that law enforcement made Kim collect this evidence, so that didn't stick. And the statutes of limitations had been changed in 1990, and Mandy's murder happened in 1989. So basically, the justices were like, tough shit, it was 1 year. And the appeals court rejected all of Tim's defense team's claims, and the charges and sentencing were upheld. And that is all I have for you this week. I'm not sure if you can tell, but I'm pretty sure I have a sinus infection, so that's fun. Also, Patreon. I have not forgotten about you. I have not, I promise. But it won't be this week either. I'm so sorry. I'm leaving tomorrow to go out of town to stay with my grandpa for a few days. And his wife has been in the hospital, and she's in a physical therapy rehab now. And I don't like the fact that he's there by himself. He also has doctor's appointments that he cannot drive himself to. So, therefore, I'll be the driver. With that being said, it'll probably be Monday instead of Friday. But I promise it's coming. I already have it wrote up. I just have to find time to actually record it. Alright, thank you guys so much. I love you so much. Leave reviews, do all the things, and let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama
murdered a podcast.